Section 17 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 3, Ancient Achievements, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Cicero, Part 2. On his return to Rome, Cicero resumed his practice in the courts with greater devotion than ever. He was now past 50 years of age, in the prime of his strength, and in the height of his forensic fame. But, notwithstanding his success and honors, his life was saddened by the growing dissensions between Caesar and Pompey, the decline of public spirit, and the approaching fall of the institutions in which he gloried. It was clear that one or the other of these fortunate generals would soon become the master of the Roman world, and that liberty was about to perish. His eloquence now became sad. He sings the death song of departing glories. He wails his jeremiads over the demoralization which was sweeping away not merely liberty, but religion, and extinguishing faith in the world. To console himself, he retired to one of his beautiful villas and wrote that immortal essay, De Oratore, which has come down to us entire. His literary genius now blazed equally with his public speeches in the Forum and in the Senate. Literature was his solace and amusement, not a source of profit, or probably of contemporary fame. He wrote treatises on the same principles that he talked with friends, or that Fra Angelico painted pictures. He renewed his attempts in poetry, but failed. His poetry is in the transcendent rhythm of his prose compositions, like that of Madame de Staël and Macaulay and Rousseau. But he was dragged from his literary and forensic life to accept the office of a governor of a province. It was forced upon him, an honor to him without a charm. Had he been venal and unscrupulous, he would have seized it with avidity. He was too conscientious to enrich himself by public corruption, as other senators did, and unless he could accumulate a fortune, the command of a distant province was an honorable exile. He was 56 years of age when he became proconsul of Sicilia, an eastern province, and all historians have united in praising his proconsulate for its justice, its integrity, and its ability. He committed no extortions, and returned home when his term of office expired, as poor as when he went. One of the highest praises which can be given to a public man who has chances of enriching himself is that he remains poor. When a member of Congress, known not to be worth $10,000, returns to his home worth $100,000, the public have an instinct that he has, somehow or other, been untrue to himself and his country. When a great man returns home from Washington poorer than when he went, his influence is apt to survive his power, and this perpetuated influence is the highest glory of a public man, the glory of Jefferson, of Hamilton, of Washington, like the voice of Gladstone during his retirement. Now Cicero had preeminently this influence as long as he lived, and it was ever exerted for the good of his country. Had his country been free, he would have died in honor. But his country was enslaved, and his voice was drowned, and he had to pay the penalty of speaking the truth about those unscrupulous men who usurped authority. On his return to Rome, the state of public affairs was most alarming. Caesar and Pompey were in antagonism. He must choose between them, and he distrusted both. Caesar was the more able, accomplished, and magnanimous, but he was the more unscrupulous and dangerous. He had ventured to cross the Rubicon, the first general who ever dared thus openly to assail his country's liberties. Pompey was pompous, overrated, and proud, and had been fortunate in the East. But then he sided with the constitutional authorities, that is, with the Senate, so far as his ambition allowed. So Cicero took his side feebly, reluctantly, as the least of the evils he had to choose, but not without vacillation, which is one of the popular charges against him. His distraction almost took the form of insanity. His consistency was an incoherence. Never did a more wretched man than Cicero resort to Pompey's camp, where he remained until his cause was lost. He returned, after the battle of Pharsalia, a suppliant at the feet of Caesar, the conqueror. This to me is one of his weakest acts. It would have been more lofty and heroic to have perished in the camp of Pompey's sons. In the midst of these public misfortunes which saddened his soul, his private miseries began. He was now prematurely an old man, under 60 years of age, almost broken down with grief. His beloved daughter Tullia, with whom his life was bound up, died, and he was divorced from his wife Terentia, a proceeding the cause of which remains a mystery. Neither in his most confidential letters nor in his conversations with most intimate friends does it appear that he ever unbosomed himself, although he was the frankest and most social of men. In his impressive silence he has set one of the noblest examples of a man afflicted with domestic infelicities. He buries his conjugal troubles in eternal silence, although he is forced to give vent to sorrows so plaintive and bitter that both friend and foe were constrained to pity. He expects no sympathy, even at Rome, for the sundering of conjugal relations, and he communicates no secrets. In his grief and sadness he does, however, a most foolish thing. He marries a young lady one third his age. She accepted him for his name and rank; he sought her for her beauty, her youth, and her fortune. This union of May with December was of course a failure. Both parties were soon disenchanted and disappointed. Neither party found happiness, only discontent and chagrin. The everlasting incongruities of such a relation, he 60 and she 19, soon led to another divorce. He expected his young wife to mourn with him the loss of his daughter Tullia. She expected that her society and charms would be a compensation for all that he had lost, yea, more, enough to make him the most fortunate and happy of mortals. In truth, he was too old a man to have married a young woman whatever were the inducements. It was the great folly of his life, an illustration of the fact that as a general thing, the older a man grows, the greater fool he becomes, so far as women are concerned. A folly that disgraced and humiliated the two wisest and greatest men who ever sat on the Jewish throne. In his accumulated sorrows Cicero now plunged for relief into literary labors. It was thus that his private sorrows were the means which Providence employed to transmit his precious thoughts and experiences to future ages, as the most valued inheritance he could bestow on posterity. What a precious legacy to the mind of the world was the book of Ecclesiastes! Yet by what bitter experiences was its wisdom earned! It was in the short period when Caesar rejoiced in the mighty power which he transmitted to the Roman emperors that Cicero wrote, in comparative retirement, his history of Roman eloquence, his inquiry as to the greatest good and evil, his Cato, his Orator, his Nature of the Gods, and his treatises on glory, on fate, on friendship, on old age, and his grandest work of all, the Offices, the best manual in ethics which has come down to us from heathen antiquity. In his studious retirements he reminds us of Bacon after his fall, when on his estate, surrounded with friends, and in the enjoyment of elegant leisure, he penned the most valued of his immortal compositions. And in those degenerate days at Rome, when liberty was crushed underfoot forever, it is beautiful to see the greatest of Roman statesmen and lawyers consoling himself and instructing posterity by his exhaustive treatises on the fundamental principles of law, of morality, and of philosophy. The assassination of Caesar by Roman senators, which Cicero seems to have foreseen, and in which he rejoiced, at this time shocked and disturbed the world. For nearly 2000 years the verdict of the civilized world respecting this great conqueror had been unanimous. But Mr. Froude has attempted to reverse this verdict, as he has in reference to Henry VIII., and as Carlyle, another idolater of force, has attempted in the cases of Oliver Cromwell and Frederick II. This remarkable word painter, in his Life of Caesar, which is however interesting from first to last, as everything he writes is interesting, has presented him as an object of unbounded admiration, as I have already noticed in my lecture on Caesar. Whether in his eagerness to say something new, or from an ill-concealed hostility to aristocratic and religious institutions, or from an admiration of imperialism, or disdain of the people in their efforts at self-government, this able special pleader seems to hail the Roman conqueror as a benefactor to the cause of civilization. But imperialism crushed all alike. The people, no longer able to send their best men to the Senate, through the higher offices perchance to represent their interests, and the nobles, shorn of the administration of the empire. Soldiers, not civilians, henceforth were to rule the world. A dreary thought to a great lawyer like Cicero, or a landed proprietor like Brutus. Even if such a terrible revolution as occurred in Rome under Caesar may have been ordered wisely by a superintending power for those degenerate times, and as a preservation of the peace of the world, that Christianity might take root and spread in countries where all religions were dead, still the prostration of what was dearest to the hearts of all true citizens by the sword was a crime, and men are not to be commended for crime, even if those crimes may be palliated. It must needs be that offences come, but woe to those by whom they come. Cicero was now 63, prematurely old, discouraged and heartbroken, and yet he braced himself up for one more grand effort, for a life and death struggle with Antony, one of the ablest of Caesar's generals, a demagogue, eloquent and popular, but outrageously cruel and unscrupulous, and with unbridled passions. Had it not been for his infatuated love of Cleopatra, he probably would have succeeded to the imperial sceptre, for it was by the sword that he too sought to suppress the liberties of the Senate and people. Against him, as the enemy of his country, Cicero did not scruple to launch forth the most terrible of his invectives. In 13 immortal philippics, some of which, however, were merely written and never delivered, after the fashion of Demosthenes, with whom as an orator and patriot he can alone be compared, he denounced the unprincipled demagogue in general with every offensive epithet the language afforded, unveiling his designs, exposing his forgeries, and proving his crimes. Nobler eloquence was never uttered, and wasted, than that with which Cicero pursued, in passionate vengeance, the most powerful and the most unscrupulous man in the Roman Empire. And Cicero must have anticipated the fate which impended over him if Antony were not a decreed public enemy. But the protests of the orator were in vain. He lived to utter them, as a witness of truth, and nothing was left to him but to die. Of course Antony, when he became triumvir, when he made a bargain that he never meant to keep with Octavius and Lepidus for a division of the empire between them, would not spare such an enemy as Cicero. The broken-hearted patriot fled mechanically, with a vacillating mind, when his proscription became known to him, now more ready to die than live, since all hope in his country's liberties was utterly crushed. Perhaps he might have escaped to some remote corner of the empire, but he did not wish for life, any more than Socrates when summoned before his judges. Desponding, uncertain, pursued, he met his fate with the heroism of an ancient philosopher. He surrendered his wearied and exhausted body to the hand of the executioner, and his lofty soul to the keeping of that personal and supreme God in whom he believed as firmly as any man, perhaps, of pagan antiquity. And surely of him, more than of any other Roman, could it be said, as Sir Walter Scott said of Pitt, and as Gladstone quoted and applied to Sir Robert Peel: "Now is the stately column broke, the beacon light is quenched in smoke, the trumpet's silver voice is still, the warder silent on the hill." With the death, so sad, of the most illustrious of the Romans whose fame was not earned on the battlefield, I should perhaps close my lecture. Yet it would be incomplete without a short notice of those services which, as statesman, orator, and essayist, he rendered to his country and to future ages and nations. In regard to his services as a statesman, they were rendered chiefly to his day and generation, for he elaborated no system of political wisdom like Burke, which bears, except casually and indirectly, on modern governments and institutions. It was his aim as a statesman to continue the Roman constitution and keep the people from civil war. Nor does he seem to have held, like Rousseau, the vox populi as the voice of God. He could find no language sufficiently strong to express his abhorrence of those who led the people for their own individual advancement. He was equally severe on corrupt governors and venal judges. He upheld morality and justice as the only guides in public affairs. He loved popularity, but he loved his country better. He hated anarchy as much as did Burke. Like Bright, he looked upon civil war as the greatest of national calamities. He advocated the most enlightened views, based on the principles of immutable justice. He wished to preserve his country equally from unscrupulous generals and unprincipled politicians. As for his orations, they also were chiefly designed for his own contemporaries. They are not particularly valuable to us, except as models of rhetorical composition and transcendent beauty and grace of style. They are not so luminous with fundamental principles as they are vivid with invective, sarcasm, wit, and telling exaggeration; sometimes persuasive and working on the sensibilities, and at other times full of withering scorn. They are more like the pleadings of an advocate than an appeal to universal reason. He lays down no laws of political philosophy, nor does he soar into the region of abstract truth, evolving great deductions in morals. But as an orator he was transcendently effective, like Demosthenes, though not equal to the Greek in force. His sentences are perhaps too involved for our taste, yet he always swayed an audience, whether the people from the rostrum, or the judges at the bar, or the senators in the curia. He seldom lost a case; no one could contend with him successfully. He called out the admiration of critics and even of actors. He had a wonderful electrical influence; his very tones and gestures carried everything before him; his action was superb, and his whole frame quivered from real or affected emotion, like Edward Everett in his happiest efforts. He was vehement in gesture, like Brougham and Mirabeau; he was intensely earnest and impressive, like Savonarola. He had exceeding tact, and was master of the passions of his audience. There was an irresistible music in his tones of voice, like that of Saint Bernard when he fanned crusades. He was withering in his denunciations, like Wendell Phillips, whom in person he somewhat resembled. He was a fascination like Pericles, and the people could not long spare him from the excitement he produced. It was their desire to hear him speak which had no small share in producing his recall from banishment. They crowded around him as the people did around Chrysostom in Antioch. He amused like an actor, and instructed like a sage. His sentences are not short, terse, epigrammic, and direct, but elaborate and artificial. Yet with all his arts of eloquence, his soul, fired with great sentiments, rose in its inspired fervor above even the melody of voice, the rhythm of language, and the vehemence of action. A listener, who was not a critic, might fancy it was gesture, voice, and language combined; but after all it was the man communicating his soul to those who hung upon his lips, and securing conviction by his sincerity and appeals to conscience. He must have had a natural gift for oratory aside from his learning and accomplishments and rhetorical arts, a talent very rare and approaching to creative genius. But to his natural gifts, like Luther or Henry Clay, born an orator, he added marvellous attainments. He had a most retentive memory. He was versed in the whole history of the world. He was always ready with apt illustrations, which gave interest and finish to his discourses. He was the most industrious and studious man of his age. His attainments were prodigious. He was master of all the knowledge then known, like Gladstone of our day. He was not so learned a man as Varro, but Varro's works have perished, as the great monuments of German scholars are perhaps destined to perish, for lack of style. Cicero's style embalmed his thoughts and made them imperishable. No writer is immortal who is not an artist. Cicero was a consummate artist, and studied the arrangement of sentences, like the historian Tacitus and the Grecian Thucydides. But greater than as an artist was he in the loftiness of his mind. He appealed to what is noblest in the soul. Transcendent eloquence ever raises mortals to the skies, and never pulls angels down. Love of country, love of home, love of friends, love of nature, love of law, love of God, is brought out in all his discourses, exalting the noblest sentiments which move the human soul. He was the first to give to the Latin language beauty and artistic finish. He added to its richness, copiousness, and strength. He gave it music. For style alone he would be valued as one of the immortal classics. All men of culture have admired it, from Augustine to Bossuet, and acknowledged their obligations to him. We accord to the great poets the formation of languages, Homer, Dante, Chaucer, Shakespeare; but I doubt if either Virgil or Horace contributed to the formation of the Latin language more than Cicero. Certainly they have not been more studied and admired. In every succeeding age the orations of Cicero have been one of the first books which have been used as text books in colleges. Is it not something to have been one of the acknowledged masters of human composition? What a great service did Cicero render to the education of the Teutonic races! Whatever the Latin language has done for the modern world, Cicero comes in for a large share of the glory. More is preserved of his writings than of any other writer of antiquity. But not for style alone, seen equally in his essays and in his orations, is he admirable. His most enduring claim on the gratitude of the world is the noble tribute he rendered to those truths which save the world. His testimony, considering he was a pagan, is remarkable in reference to what is sound in philosophy and morals. His learning, too, is seen to most advantage in his ethical and philosophical writings. It is true he did not originate, like Socrates and Plato, but he condensed and sifted the writings of the Greeks, and is the best expounder of their philosophy. Who has added substantially to what the Greeks worked out of their creative brain? I know that no Roman ever added to the domain of speculative thought, yet what Roman ever showed such a comprehension and appreciation of Greek philosophy as did Cicero? He was profoundly versed in all the learning the Grecians ever taught. Like Socrates, he had a contempt for physical science, because science in his day was based on imperfect inductions. There were not facts enough known of the material world to construct sound theories. Physical science at that time was the most uncertain of all knowledge, although there were great pretenders then, as now, who maintained it was the only certainty. But the speculations of scientists disgusted him, for he saw nothing in them upon which to base incontrovertible truth. They were mere dreams and baseless theories on the origin of the universe. They were even puerile, and they were then, as now, atheistic in their tendency. They mocked the consciousness of mankind. They annihilated faith and providence. At best, they made all things subject to necessity, to an immutable fate, not to an intelligent and ever present Creator. But Cicero, like Socrates, believed in God and in providential interference, in striking contrast with Caesar, who believed nothing. He taught moral obligation on the basis of accountability to God. He repudiated expediency as the guide in life, and fell back on the principles of eternal right. As an ethical writer he was profounder and more enlightened than Paley. He did not seek to overturn the popular religion, like Grecian sophists, only, like Socrates, to overturn ignorance, before a sound foundation could be laid for any system of truth. Nor did he ridicule religion, as Lucian did in after times, but soared to comprehend it, like the esoteric priests of Egypt in the time of Moses or Pythagoras. He cherished as lofty views of God and his moral government as any moralist of antiquity. And all these lofty views he taught in matchless language, principles of government, principles of law, of ethics, of theology, giving consolation not only to the men of his day, but to Christian sages in after times. And there is nothing puerile or dreamy or demoralizing in his teachings; they all are luminous for learning as well as genius. He rivaled Bacon in the variety and profundity of his attainments. He gloried in the certitudes which consciousness reveals, as well as in the facts which experience and history demonstrate. With these he consoled himself in trouble; on these he reposed in the hour of danger. Like Pascal, he meditated on the highest truths which task the intellect of man, but, unlike him, did not disdain those weapons which reason forged, and which no one used more triumphantly than Pascal himself. And these great meditations he transmitted for all ages to ponder, as among the most precious of the legacies of antiquity. Thus did he live, a shining light in a corrupt and godless age, in spite of all the faults which modern critics have enlarged upon in their ambitious desire for novelties, or in their thoughtless or malignant desire to show up human frailties. He was a patriot, taking the side of his country's highest interests; a statesman, seeking to conserve the wisdom of his ancestors; an orator, exposing vices and defending the innocent; a philosopher, unfolding the wisdom of the Greeks; a moralist, laying down the principles of immutable justice; a sage, pondering the mysteries of life; ever active, studious, dignified, the charm and fascination of cultivated circles; as courteous and polished as the ornaments of modern society; revered by friends, feared by enemies, adored by all good people; a kind father, and indulgent husband; a generous friend; hospitable, witty, magnificent; a most accomplished gentleman; one of the best men of all antiquity. What if he was vain and egotistical and vacillating and occasionally weak? Can you expect perfection in him who is born of a woman? We palliate the backslidings of Christians; we excuse the crimes of a Constantine, a Theodosius, a Cromwell. Shall we have no tolerations for the frailty of a pagan, in one of the worst periods of history? I have no patience with those critics who would hurl him from the pedestal on which he has stood for 2000 years. Contrast him with other illustrious men. How few Romans or Greeks were better than he! How few have rendered such exalted services! And even if he has not perpetuated a faultless character, he has yet bequeathed a noble example, and more, has transmitted a legacy in the richness of which we forget the faults of the testator, a legacy of imperishable thought, clothed in the language of imperishable art; a legacy so valuable that it is the treasured inheritance of all civilized nations, and one which no nation can afford to lose. Authorities: Plutarch's Life of Cicero; Appian; Dion Cassius; Velleius Paterculus; are the original authorities, next to the writings of Cicero himself, especially his letters and orations. Middleton's life is full, but one sided. Forsyth takes the opposite side in his life. The last work in English is that of Anthony Trollope. In Smith's Biographical Dictionary is an able article. Dr. Vaughan has written an interesting lecture. Merivale has elaborately treated this great man in his valuable History of the Romans. Colley Cibber's Character and Conduct of Cicero, Drummond's Roman History, Rollin's Ancient History, Biographic Universelle. Mr. Froude alludes to Cicero in his Life of Caesar, taking nearly the same view as Forsyth. Section 18.